Winter. So I picked up this Grand Seiko Four Seasons winter edition a few months ago. That's why we're out here in the snow. There's been a lot of Grand Seiko new releases this year, and I have to say this is probably still one of my favorites, and we'll talk about why in this video. But you know what else we're going to talk about? Why we need to stop comparing this company to Rolex. Hey guys, I'm Max and this is Watch Crunch. WatchCrunch.com is a growing online community of watch lovers looking for a better platform for talking watches. More about that at the end of the video. So recently I've seen a flurry of videos on YouTube with titles like Grand Seiko is absolutely killing Rolex. Now, I've had the pleasure of handling a good number of watches from both brands, and after spending a couple of months with my own Grand Seiko, the SBGA415 Winter Edition, I feel like I just need to weigh in here. So sit back, enjoy the B-roll, and let me tell you why I think it's kind of silly for us to be comparing these two brands to begin with. First, let's just admire this dial. This watch was one of 4 released in 2019 in the Seasons collection, and perhaps because I live in Seattle, the winter version seems most apropos. The gray dial is textured to resemble a cloudy, overcast sky with a pop of color provided by the heat-blued second hand. A feature, to me, gives this watch the edge over the spring cherry blossom edition that I reviewed. So I lied. We're gonna make just one direct comparison here with Rolex. Whereas Rolex has in the past incorporated nature quite literally, such as putting wood on the dial or drawing palm leaves with a laser, the Japanese have been a bit more poetic about the whole thing, using textures to evoke nature in a more abstract way. Okay, but that's about where the direct comparables end. So Seiko fanboys would tell you that Seiko was around decades before Rolex, but that's not what we're talking about, is it? The first Grand Seiko didn't get made until 1960, and the story goes that 2 Seiko factories competed on quality and accuracy, with the best watches eventually beating the Swiss at their own game at the observatory trials high up in the Alps. In 1968, 7 out of the 10 most accurate entries were from the land of the rising sun, including number 1, causing the sore, chocolate-eating losers to shut the competition down altogether. While that's quite the romantic story of David versus Goliath, it pales in comparison to what Hans Wilsdorf pulled off a half-century earlier, namely introduce the wristwatch to men. At the turn of the century, men's watches lived in pockets, leaving the audience of dainty wristlets as solely female. Wilsdorf, in his marketing genius, slapped his watches on the burliest of men, from divers to climbers, from explorers to eventually pilots, and in the process changing the perception of an entire industry, to the point that now it's the ladies complaining that there aren't enough good watches for them. So it seems like when it comes to heritage, Grand Seiko has a wonderful script made for Hollywood, but Rolex has one destined for the history books. Another big reason why I find it hard to compare Grand Seiko to Rolex is in their respective design languages. Much like how Japanese cars took over the world in the 70s and 80s, Grand Seiko seems to be coming at this from an angle of microscopic precision. Now, much has been said about their Zaratsu case polishing, but just look at these hour markers for a second. Usually simple placeholders, on the Grand Seiko, it's polished to bounce light like a gemstone. This is aided by the case design. The Titanium 62 GS case is virtually bezel-less, bringing the dial higher up and leaving the sapphire crystal sitting almost entirely above the case. This allows more light to enter from the sides of the crystal, and when that light hits the aforementioned elements on that dial, magic. But with the highlights, there come some lowlights. For example, this bracelet has no taper. The clasp has an edge that protrudes just enough to be annoying, which is why I prefer my Grand Seiko on a strap. The lugs I find a bit blocky, and this big lion logo obscures something that they really ought to be proud to show off. With Rolex, on the other hand, whether you like their design or not, it's hard to use the word afterthought in any of their descriptions. Though I will admit, Rolex has become a bit too big and flashy as of late for my taste and has gotten away from their tool watch roots. Nevertheless, each detail feels premeditated and perseverated on. For example, their bracelets are some of the best in the business. The complex flowing lines of an oyster case is sublime, and just look at what they did with the lugs on the new Submariner. How OCD were those designers? Moreover, Rolex dial design just makes sense to me. So dress watches use baton hour markers. Sports watches have more bold shapes like circles and rectangles, and a watch that sits in between uses a combination of batons and Arabics. So don't get me wrong, dressier Grand Seikos are elegant as hell, but you can't simply slap a bezel on a snowflake and call it a GMT or a diver. You gotta try harder than that. Now, I think I know what Grand Seiko's problem is here. If they get too bold with their dials, their sports watches start to look like a Presage, or worse, a Samurai or Turtle, and that is the Seiko baggage that Grand Seiko has to drag behind them. Now guys, can I ask you to head down there and drop a like for this video? And before you light me up in the comments as a Grand Seiko hater, on the technology front, the brand gets itself right back in the game. So in the 70s, following the quartz crisis, the Royal Oak proved to the watch industry that you can make a business on the idea of craftsmanship instead of brutal accuracy alone. And the Swiss really never looked back from that formula. Then here comes Grand Seiko, like an underdog character in a movie who's been doing push-ups and drinking raw eggs in his basement, unveiled to the world the spring drive movement in 1999. 2 decades in the making. It marries the greatest things about mechanical and quartz with none of the sacrifices. Here you have a caliber that needs no battery, is twice as accurate as any Rolex, has 3 days of power reserve, and best of all, generates a completely mesmerizingly hypnotic, smooth sweep. And that is why if I'm gonna have one Grand Seiko, it's gotta be a spring drive. Grand Seiko has gained a lot of ground in terms of brand image in the past few years, and they're working hard to shake the just a Seiko moniker, but to say that it's even in the same league as Rolex as far as brand recognition is a delusion. Don't believe me? Get off Instagram and ask one of your non-watch friends what a Grand Seiko is. Now, I do think that due to Rolex's stubborn reluctance to increase production, it's given Grand Seiko a foothold, at least amongst frustrated collectors. So I know it feels like I've told you why we can't compare Grand Seiko to Rolex by comparing Grand Seiko to Rolex. But my point is, to me, the two brands excel at very different things. Rolex brings history, gravitas, an evolved design language, whereas Grand Seiko feels more like the new kid on the block. Bright-eyed, clean-cut, full of energy and new ideas, but it's still a bit rough around the edges. I love both brands for different reasons. But guys, buy a Grand Seiko because you like how it makes you feel. Don't get it because someone on the internet says that it annihilates Rolex. But what do you think? Let's continue this conversation on WatchCrunch.com. We developed WatchCrunch because we felt like if we talked about a topic like this on the forums, fire would immediately break out, the internet police would come out, multiple people would get banned. And we also know that no one is on IG to have conversations. So we made WatchCrunch.com to be a safe place for watch lovers to talk watches whilst delivering a sleek interface and more watch-specific features. So come join us. I'll put a link to this topic in the pinned comments below. As always, great chat, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.